scores more confirmed dead.
2020 is now the deadliest year in U.S. history.
Tell me what law I have broken. You cannot tell me any law that I've broken.
It's going to get worse and worse and worse.
Life is a collection of stuff that happens, and in 2020, a lot of stuff happened. 5 years. 5 long years. That's how long it's been when the strangest and most consequential year so far in the 21st century occurred. You might not think that it was that long ago, but it was. For many, it was eons ago, a distant memory of a dark age best left forgotten. But since it's been 5 years, I've been feeling a little nostalgic about 2020 recently. A lot has changed since then for me. I graduated college, got a job, started doing YouTube as a hobby.
That is one big pile of shit.
And even had a chance to go on some nice trips. On the other hand, life has also gotten more complicated since. I gained more responsibility and I've lost some family members that I've known my whole life. Strangely, 2020 was a simpler time for me when everyone was young and alive, and college was the only thing that I had to worry about. I felt a strange sense of camaraderie with the world because it felt like for the first time in my life, everyone on the planet was dealing with the same problem at the same time, that we were all in this together. Or at least it felt like that in the beginning of 2020, because once we get to the midpoint, things get a little bit dicey. During 2020, my life also got a lot easier when university classes moved online and all the tests were open book. Because I could do school from home, I got to spend more time with family and even have more free time to spend on hobbies or go to the gym because I no longer had to commute. I know this might sound weird, but honestly for me, 2020 was pretty alright. But for a lot of people, it wasn't. It was a year of loss, anxiety, loneliness, social and political upheaval. We had to hide in our homes, constantly sterilize our environment and wear masks. We had to avoid socializing and shut down. Everyone was afraid of being infected and whether all the chaos around us would bring down our very societies. No one knew what was coming next and whether the world would ever be the same again. The new normal was the word of the year. Of course, looking back now, our world in 2025 is pretty similar to what it was before 2020, and all the measures and lessons adopted during 2020 have kind of been cast aside by most. I mean, when's the last time you saw someone wearing a mask? But for some, the scars and fears remain. For some, a part of themselves was left behind. The same goes for me as well. I wish I could go back to the time before 2020, when my grandma and great-grandma were still alive, because as time passes, everything dies piece by piece. In this video, I want to share and summarize with you all the major events that occurred in a 4-month period from December 2019 to the end of March 2020, and even a little bit about my personal experiences, because these 4 months would change the world and us, and define 2020 as, for better or worse, as the most impactful year in the 21st century. Even though we all left a part of ourselves behind in 2020, maybe remembering it together could bring us some solace. I won't cover all the events, just the ones that I found to be the most important. I want you to tell me at the end whether you believe that 2020 was truly as significant and bad as everyone says, and also maybe share your own experiences if you feel like it. Also, as an FYI, I'll be covering the early events of 2020 from a mostly Canadian and American perspective, so a lot of the events will be related to North America. So, let's get right into it. Now before we continue, if you guys like this video, please like, subscribe, and comment below and let me know what you think. Also, if you want to support me further, you can always leave a super thanks or become a member, but that's not necessary. Anyways, let's get started.
In Brazil, the coronavirus has carved its terrible marks upon the earth. They've buried hundreds upon hundreds here, and they're ready for thousands more.
December 2019, the calm before the storm. At the end of 2019, I was just a dumb 23-year-old university student studying accounting. And before you ask, I started university at 22 years old because I essentially drifted around for a while, not knowing what to do with my life. So technically, I was just in my second year of university, and it wasn't one of those guys that takes forever to get their degree. Anyhow, in December 2019, the things that I was worried about was my upcoming exams and what I was going to do for the winter break. But across the ocean on the Chinese mainland, something dark was brewing. Something that would change our lives forever. But no one knew exactly what it was at the time. For now, we lived in blissful ignorance. On December 1st, in the city of Wuhan, a Chinese man in his 70s had fallen ill with a high fever and pneumonia. He was quickly admitted to a local hospital, but it wouldn't be long before many others were admitted to the hospital as well, showing similar symptoms. A lot of these cases would soon be linked to the local animal market, or wet markets as many of you have probably already heard. More specifically, they were linked to the Huan seafood wholesale market. Soon after being admitted, the patient began to exhibit some strange signs and the doctors began to suspect that this wasn't regular pneumonia. They took samples from the patient's lungs and sent them to a genetic sequencing company to help discover the cause of the disease. Early tests identified the virus as something similar to SARS. The Chinese Center of Disease Control and Prevention was notified, but the news was kept a secret from the public. This wouldn't be the last time that the Chinese authorities would try to keep things under wraps. But the virus started to spread rapidly, infecting thousands. The infected would soon begin to double every few days. Soon, even the highly advanced censorist regime of China wouldn't be able to keep it all under wraps. Back in the United States, people were busy with a much different issue, for you see a new domestic crisis was arising. On December 5, 2019, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, would ask a House committee to begin drafting the articles of impeachment against Trump. Remember when Trump got impeached the first time? I honestly forgot about this because there's so much other wild nonsense that's happened since. A few days later, on December 10, 2019, the Democrats announced formal charges against Trump. And on December 18, 2019, the House of Representatives approved the articles of impeachment, and Donald Trump became the third US president to be impeached, after Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton. Quite an interesting club to be a part of. On the brighter side, 2 days later on December 20th, 2019, the United States Space Force was founded, so well, there's that I suppose. On December 28, 2019, the New York Times released an article saying that 2019 was the best year on record. The world was more peaceful and disease, famine, and poverty were at the lowest they've ever been in the human experience. But well, 2020 wouldn't continue the legacy. Honestly, nothing more represents the calm before the storm than this article. I remember liking 2019 a lot as well, and honestly it does seem like a lot of people did as well. Like literally the entire world was steaming towards a wall, but we were all blind to it. Well, at least most of us were blind to it. Back in China, some people were starting to realize that something bad was coming. But honestly, when you think about it, 2019 was the best year ever, because it's been downhill ever since. I mean, before 2020, we didn't have the same lockdowns, inflation, cost of living, supply chain issues, and many other problems. Or, well, at least they weren't as bad. Back in China, on December 30th, 2019, the head of the emergency department at the Wuhan Central Hospital was handed the results of the lung sample tests. At the top of the report, it stated clearly that this was SARS. To give you some context, the previous outbreak of SARS occurred in the early 2000s and go on to infect 8,000 people and kill 800 worldwide. The Chinese government attempted back then to cover it up, but this would have only led to additional death. The Chinese government would apologize and promise to be more transparent in the future, but let's just say that they wouldn't keep their word this time. The head of the emergency department would soon send screenshots of the report over WeChat to their colleagues. This message would soon reach her hospital colleague, Li Wenlang. With the screenshot, Li would issue a warning message to his students. Don't circulate the message outside this group. Get your family and loved ones to take precautions. Of course, the students, either out of concern or just wishing to share this juicy information with others, decided to send the message out to their friends and family. Soon, millions of people on Chinese social media were seeing this warning. The news that a disease outbreak was occurring was now going mainstream, and people around the world started to notice. In the West, on December 30th, 2019, Reuters published an article called Chinese Officials Investigate Cases of Pneumonia Outbreak in Wuhan. The article mentions that the Chinese authorities are claiming that there are only 27 cases of viral pneumonia in Wuhan. The article references that the Chinese government made this statement after rumors about the spread of SARS began to circulate on social media. Reuters would cite the People's Daily newspaper, which itself would state that they could not confirm the cause of the disease and whether it was SARS as rumors on Chinese social media were claiming. The Chinese authorities were still officially running with the story that it was just viral pneumonia. The Wuhan Municipal Health Commission would tell Reuters that the patients were isolated and that their close contacts were under observation. In addition, the local seafood market was being investigated and cleaned up. In addition, the commission would state that their tests were showing the disease as viral pneumonia, and no human-to-human transmission had been detected. What's interesting is at the end of this article, Reuters references how China had covered up the previous SARS outbreak in the early 2000s. And as we will sooner learn, China was lying about almost everything. They were lying about the human-to-human transmission, they were lying about the pneumonia claims, and they were also lying that only 27 people were infected. Of course, what is mentioned in this article, it just isn't true. This isn't the fault of Reuters, but instead the Chinese government, which was still trying its best to cover things up. By December 31st, 2019, the news was spreading around the world, outside of China, at least to those that were paying attention. Medical experts from around the world started to call Professor Gao, the head of the Chinese Center of Disease Control and Prevention. But Gao didn't seem all that worried and rejected the outside help. Dr. Peter Daszak of EcoHealth Alliance had even sent an offer to send an entire team to help, but Gao simply responded by wishing him a happy new year. Ian Lipkin from Columbia University will call Gao on New Year's Eve. During this call, Gao would admit that this wasn't SARS, but instead was actually a new virus. But Gao assured him that this virus was not highly transmissible, and that human-to-human transmissions had not been detected. Of course, this was directly contradicted by the fact that thousands every few days were being infected, and hospitals were being filled to the brim. Also, international law dictates that outbreaks of new infectious diseases should be reported to the World Health Organization within 24 hours, but China would take their sweet time. Again, at this time the Chinese government wanted to cover this up and try to solve it without the world finding out. Why, you may ask? Well, probably to avoid public panic, social and economic tension, and to avoid embarrassment on the international stage. So essentially by late December, millions of people in China and somewhere around the world knew that something bad was happening. The popular suspicion was that it was another SARS outbreak, but the Chinese government would deny it and push their viral pneumonia narrative and assure everyone that it was no big deal. Of course, both sides were wrong, because it was actually a completely different virus. Most people in the West were completely ignorant of this news. For them, they were concerned with the Christmas holidays and New Year's, wishing for a good and prosperous year to come. But the viral outbreak that would shut down the world and cause massive amounts of economic, political, and social damage was now in full swing. And despite the Chinese government's efforts to hide and contain it, it would break out, and soon even the censorship regime of China would be forced to admit the truth. And the rest of the world will now have to face the price because of China's secrecy and general incompetence. But that wouldn't become apparent until the next month. January 2020, the storm begins. In early January, more and more news articles were starting to appear in Western newspapers talking about some mysterious disease ravaging its way across Wuhan. Again, the rumors on social media about SARS were abounding, but the government was still sticking to this viral pneumonia story. Even though the Chinese government was aware that it wasn't regular pneumonia or SARS, they decided to stick with the story to prevent panic. Most of the world was still ignorant to this trouble, not for a lack of care, but mostly because, well, China wasn't being honest and, well, let's face it, the world offered many other things in the way of trouble. Australia itself was on fire, with some of the worst bushfires raging across the country in living memory. Over 24.3 million hectares and 3,000 buildings were burnt, and 34 people were killed. Around this time on January 1st, 2020, members of WHO were already having late night calls to discuss this new virus and what to do about it. Of course, China still hadn't shared any information about the new virus, and so WHO was still mostly in the dark. In fact, it wouldn't be until January 3rd that China would actually talk with WHO, but even then, they were vague and still refused to share any data. On January 2nd, 2020, the Wuhan Public Security Bureau started to go after doctors that were spreading information about the disease that the government wanted to keep a secret. The media and government referred to these doctors as rumor mongers and internet users. Those damn internet users were at it again. In fact, Li, the doctor who had shared the warning about SARS with his students and caused the news to go viral, would be admonished by security officials for spreading false information. He would later become infected himself and die on February 7th, 2020. Many at that time and even today believe that the government may have played a role in his death, but there's really no evidence to back up this claim. On January 3rd, 2020, the National Health Commission of China sent a secret memo banning unauthorized scientists from researching the virus and disclosing information to the public. Also during this time, Chinese scientists led by Zhang had fully sequenced the disease, but again couldn't share it. The scientists had discovered that this new disease was very similar to SARS and thereby transmissible from human to human. This is news that China wouldn't share until almost the end of the month. Also on January 3rd, 2020, a US drone struck Iranian General Qasem Soleimani at an Iraqi airport. This was one of the most brazen attacks on Iran by the United States since the 1980s. Iran responded a few days later by launching missiles at Iraqi military bases that housed US soldiers. All of a sudden, people were afraid that World War III was coming. In the United States, everyone thought that the federal government was going to reinstate conscription. Like, the fear was so bad that the Selective Service website crashed because so many people were going on it to see if they could somehow exempt themselves from the draft. And then right after this entire event, the Iranians shot down Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752 and killed 176 people. I mean, my goodness, the situation was just escalating again and again. But things calmed down between the United States and Iran once the pandemic became the main focus. So I guess, thank you, pandemic? Let me know below whether the pandemic was better than a World War III scenario. With all these things going on, it's no surprise that many were still oblivious to the threat across the sea. But even though people were completely occupied by dread and fear, the world had no attention or mercy. In China, everything was getting worse. On January 11th, the first death from the coup was reported in China. Also, Zhang would, without permission from the Chinese government, release the sequencing data of the virus. This led to personal consequences for him, but he felt that it was the right thing to do. I mean, there were a lot of Chinese scientists that put themselves on the line to warn the world, and honestly, hats off to them. On January 16th, 2020, the impeachment trial of Donald Trump began in the US Senate. Opinions on Trump were pretty much split along party lines, and since the Republicans controlled the Senate, there was absolutely no chance that Trump would be convicted of anything. On January 20th, the first case of human-to-human transmission was confirmed by China and the World Health Organization. Also on the same day, the United States reported its first case. On January 23, 2020, quarantines and isolation for those suspected or infected were common. Lockdowns were beginning to be enforced by the government of China, and neighbors were being encouraged to report on each other if anyone was breaking quarantine rules. I remember seeing footage of people having iron bars welded onto their windows and doors to keep them from leaving their homes. I mean, it was honestly starting to look like a zombie apocalypse was going on over there with all these measures. Foreigners in China were seen as suspicious and sometimes isolated just to being foreign. I mean, China's a little bit xenophobic. Remember the time that Disney made John Boyega smaller on the Chinese Star Wars posters? Petridge Farm remembers. On January 25, 2020, the first case of the coof was reported in Canada after a man in his 50s traveled to Toronto from China. Afterward, on January 26, 2020, Kobe Bryant died in a helicopter crash. I feel like a lot of people don't remember that this happened in 2020, but yes, Kobe died right before the pandemic, and most people feel like it happened before because of how overshadowed it was by later events. So as you can see, January was already a pretty packed month, even without the presence of a viral outbreak. I mean, seriously, there was no chill in 2020. The year began immediately with a bang and it just got worse and worse from there. Natural disasters, the assassination of a major political and military figure, and the death of one of the most famous athletes of all time, it wasn't going to get any easier. On the 30th, WHO officially declared a global health emergency, making it the 6th time that they would do this declaration since 2009. And then later on the 31st, at the end of the month, the US issued travel restrictions on entering from China, and Britain officially left the EU. So a big day for people on both sides of the pond. By the end of January, the situation was becoming critical, and pretty much everyone and their mother had heard of the coof. People were starting to get scared, and early hoarding of hand sanitizers, masks, and other cleaning supplies were starting to begin, though it wouldn't really become a major problem until late February. Cases were still negligible in the West, and the healthcare system was still operating under normal conditions for the most part. There were no lockdowns or restrictions in Canada or the United States, and people were still free to travel domestically and internationally. Well, unless you were going to China, that is. There were still no capacity restrictions, and overall things were still pretty normal. The problem still appeared small and mostly an issue in faraway China. A lot of people were still hopeful that this would pass quickly and that we would go on as normal, but oh boy were they wrong. On the plus side, in January 2020, the film 1917 won the Golden Globe for the Best Drama Picture, so well, there you go for all you movie buffs out there. For me personally, I was back in university during this time, starting my last year. I was on track to graduate in the winter of 2020, and I was already getting ready to begin the process of applying for jobs at accounting firms during this time. Now you might be wondering why I'm applying for jobs when I still had a year left at university. Well, it's because in the accounting world, you need to apply 1 year ahead of time for entry-level jobs at a university. So for a job starting in the fall of 2021, I need to apply in 2020. I'm not exactly sure why this is the case, but that's just how it worked. I applied in the summer of 2020 for a job in the fall of 2021, and luckily I got it. And the pandemic really helped because there was a serious labor shortage going on. Recruit season, a time when we meet representatives from different firms and we network with them, would officially start in the spring. And during this time, I was getting prepared for it. I was a little bit nervous because, to be honest, I'm kind of introverted. But luckily for me, I wouldn't have to meet anyone in person. In January 2020, I attended an information session for a major accounting firm in Canada called M&P. Now during these job events, you're supposed to hand out business cards with your information on them so that the person from the firm can remember you. Now people usually buy regular paper cards or whatever, but I wanted to be different. I wanted to be special, so I had business cards made from plastic, so that just by touching my card, you knew that it was my card and that I would stand out from the rest. It cost me around $56 for 25 cards. And oh boy, was I ready to meet these firm reps and show myself out there. But well, I never handed out a single card because the lockdowns happened and all the in-person networking events were cancelled and went online over Zoom. Obviously, I couldn't hand them out over Zoom and I wasn't going to mail them out, so to this day, 5 years later, I'm still stuck with these 25 plastic cards. A reminder of my failure, shame, and a waste of $56. A reminder of what 2020 took from me. Damn you 2020, give it back. Give me back my $56. Anyways, let's move on to February, which I think was probably one of the weirdest months in the entire year, because it was a month when everything seemed normal, but weird at the same time, like you were in an eerie place. February, world in limbo. February was a really weird month, especially the first half. The quarantines and the health restrictions hadn't become a thing yet, but at the same time the coof was now a household name, and everyone knew that more likely than not, things were going to get worse. It was kind of like being on a sinking ship that hadn't really taken on too much water yet, and everyone was still unsure of how much time we had left. Life was still pretty normal for the most part. People still went to their jobs and school in person, had social gatherings, and still didn't take any safety precautions. But a lot of people were starting to get anxious about the future, what might be coming down the pipeline. Like when you get that strange feeling in your gut that something is wrong but everything around you seems fine. It's kind of hard to explain. More and more people were talking about the disease and the possibility of a pandemic, but again, no one knew exactly how and when things would go down. Everything was a mystery. The future was uncertain, but at this point the disease was global and there was no containing it in China. And this limbo everyone was stuck in would quickly collapse into complete and utter chaos later on in the month. On February 1st, 2020, major corporations such as Apple announced that they were closing their offices in China temporarily due to health concerns. On February 2nd, 2020, on Groundhog Day, a hog in Pennsylvania with an unpronounceable name didn't cast a shadow, and thereby an early spring was predicted. I mean, that's good, right? The spring will be a good one. I'm sure nothing bad will happen. Oh wait, actually it won't be, and only hell awaits. On the same day, a death from the disease was reported in the Philippines, making it the first death of its kind outside of China. Also, other countries such as New Zealand, which had some of the strictest lockdowns in the Western world, would officially restrict travel from China. Also, the 2nd of February was a Sunday, and you know what that means? The Super Bowl. The Kansas City Chiefs would beat the San Francisco 49ers 31-20 to win the 34th Super Bowl. This would be the first Super Bowl win by Kansas City since 1970. So a Super Bowl and a groundhog giving good news, not a bad day overall, except for the first coof death outside of China, but don't worry, I'm sure it won't get any worse. On February 3rd, 2020, the Cruise Lines International Association banned trips to China and stated that anyone who had recently traveled to China will be not allowed to board any cruise ships. This would of course be the beginning of the trouble that the cruise industry would suffer for almost 2 years. Also, the Democratic and Republican primaries began in Iowa for the 2020 presidential election, which itself will be a complete disaster as we all know. Also, the impeachment trial of Trump that began last month was close to its end, and on February 3rd, closing statements were being made by both sides. On February 4th, China reported the total death toll from the coof was now over 400, but told the world not to panic because everything was under control. I'm sure they're probably right and we have nothing to worry about, ladies and gentlemen. Also, the cruise liner Diamond Princess was quarantined and tested for the coof cases when it docked in Japan. Over 3,000 passengers were required to stay on the ship. In the beginning, it was only supposed to be for a day, but soon these travelers would find themselves stuck on a complete hell for weeks on end. In the end, multiple people would die and passengers would spend weeks on that ship. Early 2020 was a terrible time to have a vacation. Rest in peace for all those who wasted thousands just to be quarantined for days. Also on the same day, Trump would deliver his third State of the Union speech, and Nancy Pelosi would rip up her copy of the speech in protest, one of the most iconic moments of Trump's first presidency. On February 5th, a baby in China was diagnosed with the coof, and thereby became the first example of an infant being infected. Also on this day, the US Senate votes 52-48 to acquit Donald Trump on the first article of impeachment. In order to get a conviction, you had to get at least a 2/3 majority. The vote was pretty much on party lines, and then the Senate voted 53-47 to acquit Trump on the second article of impeachment, and Mitt Romney was the only Republican senator to vote to impeach. And this was the end of the first impeachment saga. Of course, there will be another impeachment attempt in early 2021, and who knows, maybe there'll be a third someday. On February 7th, we had Batterygate. Apple was fined 25 million euros by the French government for deliberately slowing down the older iPhone model. Now, I always had a suspicion that Apple was doing this because seriously, my phone would just dip in quality out of nowhere when the new iPhones came out. Like pre-planned obsolescence is just a regular policy for Western corporations. I mean, back in the old days, you could buy a phone and that bad boy could probably survive the nuclear apocalypse. But today, it can barely survive the year. Also on the 7th, my special plastic business cards arrived from Vistaprint, and I still have them, just sitting in my room reminding me of the money that I wasted. I didn't hand out a single one, and they're completely useless to me today because, well, they have outdated information on them. I'm not saying that I was the biggest victim of 2020, but I'm sure that I might be the top contender. On February 8th, 2020, a video appeared from China of Chinese officials forcefully taking people into quarantine. The lockdown by the Chinese government was starting to become much more severe as China tried desperately to contain the situation before it caused too much social and economic instability and damaged China's image abroad. On February 9th, we had the Oscars, and the South Korean film Parasite won the most awards such as Best Picture. I've never seen this film, but I remember hearing a lot of good things about it, so check it out if you haven't seen it yet. On more negative news, the death toll from coof now exceeds 910, officially becoming higher than SARS, which peaked around 800. On February 10th, the death toll actually surpassed 1,000 people, and WHO officially names the new disease. Also in political news, Andrew Yang and Michael Bennet suspended their presidential campaigns. Oh, what the world could have been. Imagine a Yang America. On February 12th, WhatsApp broke 2 billion users, becoming the largest social media platform behind Facebook. And guess what? Mark Zuckerberg owns it all. He's your master now. Bow before him, ye simple peasants. Anyways, on February 13th, Chinese officials reported over 13,000 new cases, the largest single day amount so far, and Japan will report its first death. On February 14th, the first case of the coof is found in Africa, in the great ancient land of Egypt. The day after, on the 15th of February, France suffered its first death from the disease, making it the first death of its kind in Europe. The victim was an 80-year-old tourist from China. Honestly, I really feel like if we had just completely closed off all travel to and from China at the beginning of January, a lot of the spread could have been contained. But unfortunately, the wheels of change spin very slowly. A few days later, on February 23, 2020, countries like South Korea and Italy started reporting hundreds of cases showing the disease was now spreading rapidly outside of China. On February 24th, stock markets around the world started to tumble. The anxiety from the coup started to make its way through the world economy, and many, anticipating serious disruptions, sold their stocks and moved their money into cash or reinvested it into more stable assets. The S&P 500 and the Nasdaq fell by 3%. Not too bad, but it's going to get a lot worse. On February 27th, it got a lot worse. The stock market would crash by 1,190 points, or 4.4%. Essentially, it was the biggest downturn since the 2008 financial crisis. Honestly, looking back, this would have been the best time to buy stocks, because in a few months the market would recover and go into overdrive in the spring and summer. Buying the dip right now would have been extremely profitable. Overall, 2020 was actually a really good year to make money, and I completely dropped the ball. Like, I was planning to buy a bunch of Tesla stock because it had crashed as well, but ultimately didn't because, well, I never really purchased stocks before, and it was a little bit uncomfortable getting involved. Also, I was a poor university student and didn't really feel like spending my money. But honestly, if I had bought some Tesla stock at under $200, I would have made a lot of money, because in the summer that stock at one point went over $2,000, a 10 times return in a matter of months. But 2020 was a year that I lost a lot of money. Again, not saying that I was the biggest victim of 2020, but it was rough, alright? Anyways, by the end of the week on the 28th of February, the stock market had lost $6 trillion in value. The Dow Jones, just on that day alone, dropped another 800 points and overall had dropped 4,000 points or 13% during the entire week. In addition, the Geneva Motor Show was cancelled in Switzerland after the government banned gatherings of over 1,000 people. Meanwhile, Italy recorded another 464 cases and their total death toll rose to 21. On February 29th, because it was a leap year, the United States government and the Taliban signed a conditional peace agreement that will lead to the gradual withdrawal of American troops. Now, I'm sure this will go fantastically and not lead to any sort of a disaster that might draw comparisons with the Vietnam in 1975. Don't worry guys, the Patriots are in charge. Also on this day, the disease was detected in Ecuador, Ireland, Qatar, Luxembourg. Meanwhile, Australia and the United States both would record their first deaths. The latter occurred in Seattle, a city that I was previously back in December. Don't worry folks, I was fine. And ladies and gentlemen, those were the major events for February. Like I said, it was a weird month. Things were getting bad, especially in the latter half of the month, but overall the world was still very light on restrictions, and most people in countries such as Canada and the United States were going about their lives as normal. We still did our 9 to 5s, but we knew that something was about to change. Life seemed normal and abnormal at the same time, as if we knew in our gut that the Titanic was headed for the iceberg, but we just couldn't see it yet with our own eyes. In February, it still wasn't a complete certainty that 2020 would be dramatically different from previous years, but the risk of it being that way was there. Anxiety was keeping people up at night, and it would be the next month when things would really change forever, when 2020 would leave its mark on our lives as the most unusual year in living memory. December, January, and February were the setup, and March was the inciting incident that would change the story forever. March, the world on fire. March was Judgment Day, or maybe Judgment Month. If February was the equivalent of a crab being slowly boiled, March was the equivalent of being tossed into the damn furnace. This was the month that the pandemic went from being that distant issue in a faraway land to being something right next door. The limbo and the trance of February was over, and the 2020 we remember today officially began. People now started to hoard masks, hand sanitizers, and toilet paper. Seriously, remember when there was a literal toilet paper shortage because for some reason people thought that you needed to stockpile it? It didn't help with the disease and toilet paper production didn't fall. The shortages were literally just caused by everyone and their mother freaking out and rushing to buy it like it was a PS5 or something. Honestly, to this day I still have no idea why everyone thought that toilet paper was so important. We were also starting to suffer from mask shortages, and experts decided to start telling people to not buy and wear masks. Again, you might think this is weird considering that masking up will be extremely important later on in the pandemic, but things were still a little weird at the beginning. The experts were essentially telling people not to buy masks because they didn't really help with the disease. Of course, later on we would find out that the medical experts said this falsehood on purpose to make sure that there were enough masks for doctors and nurses. Now, statements like this would eventually lead to a lot of distrust between ordinary citizens and the medical expert class, and this distrust would eventually break into anti-lockdown protests, and people would start using ivermectin and other weird things. Remember when Rogan used a horse dewormer to cure himself? Okay, I'm just kidding, there's actually a human version, and I think it might have actually worked. I mean, you can trust this guy. Anyway, let's get back on track. While this was going on at the beginning of March, I was getting ready for my midterm exams, and looking forward to that 1 week of spring break in mid-March. At this point, our classes and exams were still in person. What I didn't know at this time was that this would actually be the last week that I would attend any classes in person at my university, because I would end up graduating during the lockdowns in early 2021. At this point, most universities were still waiting to see what would happen next. Moving things online would be quite a hassle, and no one wanted to prematurely start the transition. They were literally just waiting for each other to act. On March 9th, 2020, Italy became the first Western country to impose nationwide lockdowns due to a large increase in cases and deaths. Meanwhile, the global stock markets plunged to the lowest levels not seen since the 2008 crash. The Dow Jones fell by 7.8% or more than 2,000 points. This day would become known as Black Monday. 2 days later, on March 11th, WHO officially declares a global pandemic, and in response on March 12th, the Dow Jones falls by another 2,300 points, the worst loss for the index since 1987. At the end of the week on March 13th, Nepal closed down Mount Everest to tourists. Also on this day, Canada recorded its first death in North Vancouver. Now all of this was happening during my spring break, and I was starting to get a little bit nervous about the future. For starters, I was starting to see other universities announcing online learning, but my university was still silent. No one, including other students or teachers, knew exactly what was going on. Like, we were all just hoping and waiting for the university to do something, but they were taking their sweet time. A few days later, on March 14th, the Saturday before classes were supposed to resume in person, we got an email. A university was announcing transition to remote learning. Now we would be having classes on Zoom and handing in everything online. I had no idea what Zoom was, and it was a spectacular disaster when it first started. People not unmuting themselves and teachers not knowing how to set up calls. It was a great old time. Honestly, I highly recommend watching this Andrew Dodson video where he does a skit about the chaos of universities moving to online learning. Honestly, the funniest part was when one student asked our professor if the exams would be online, and she was like, things will probably be back to normal by then, so no need to think about that right now. Oh boy, was she wrong. I remember some professors joking about how Isaac Newton invented calculus or whatever while he was still in quarantine, and it's like, sir, the average university student isn't inventing anything. He or she is going to be gaming or watching Tiger King. Can't blame her for being optimistic, because at the beginning, health experts were saying that we just needed 2 weeks of lockdown to flatten the curve. Of course, it would take 2 years instead. Anyhow, on March 16th, 2020, the Dow Jones fell by another 3,000 points or 12.97%. This was the largest point drop since the 1929 stock market crash. I mean, the world was falling apart, people. Everyone was worried about their health, and now there were fears of a recession coming, and people started to worry about their jobs. It was complete chaos. On the same day, on March 16th, 2020, Canada officially announced travel restrictions, and plans for spring break were cancelled. This actually reminds me of that one guy who was in Florida for spring break and spoke with the news and said that he didn't care, that nothing was going to stop him from partying.
If I get corona, I get corona. At the end of the day, I'm not going to let it stop me from partying.
The whole internet crapped on him for a while, but honestly, I've come to respect him. I wonder where he is now. Keep partying, buddy. Keep partying. The day after, on March 20th, 2020, the EU countries closed their borders for 30 days to stop the spread. The United States and Canada closed their border to non-essential traffic. Non-commercial traffic at the border came to an almost complete standstill, which is kind of happening again with the tariffs in 2025. Anyhow, in March 2020, the largest undefended border in the world had been locked down. On the brighter news, on the same day, Pfizer signed a deal with BioNTech to help develop a vaccine, and by the end of the year, Pfizer will begin rolling them out. Also on this day, China only reported one new case and would pretty much stop reporting cases afterwards. Now, they might have gotten things under control through extremely authoritarian measures that Western countries couldn't do, but I think it's more likely that they were probably just lying. I mean, they did have a history of that. There's no way that a gigantic country like China didn't have more than 100,000 cases. Like, they're tripping, dog. Xi Jinping was selling everyone some BS green tea, and I ain't drinking it, especially if it was made in the wet markets. Also, did you know that in the Dongyang region of China, there's a special dish called a virgin boy egg? It's a specially prepared egg that's dipped in the urine of a virgin boy. Yum. Anyhow, I don't know why I told you that, but now you know. Anyways, on the same day, the Eurovision contest was cancelled, the first time that happened in its history. On March 19th, 2020, Italy deployed its army to Bergamo to help collect and transport dead bodies. The crematoriums couldn't keep up, and a large number of bodies were just piling up, and therefore the army helped spread out the bodies to other cities. In total, Italy has suffered over 3,400 deaths at this point, exceeding the death toll in China. Also, on this day, California, the largest state in the United States, issued a stay-at-home order, where only essential travel was allowed, such as important errands, medical services, and groceries. On March 20th, it was announced that the total death toll has surpassed 10,000 people worldwide, and total cases reached 250,000. Things were now starting to get a little bit wild, and public anxiety was an all-time high. Furthermore, the states of Illinois, New York, and Connecticut issued a statewide stay-at-home orders to combat the spread. Also on this same day, the game Doom Eternal released. Now, I actually remember playing this game a lot. In fact, I remember that while I was playing it, I was constantly hearing bad news. So fighting demons and kind of genociding them was a very good release of my frustrations. I actually haven't played the game since. Maybe one day I'll get back to it. Anyways, on March 22nd, 2020, the governor of Ohio Ohio issued a stay-at-home order as well. On the 23rd, the governors of Massachusetts and Michigan also issued stay-at-home orders. Now, the Michigan lockdown would be the most consequential, as eventually a conspiracy to kidnap the governor by anti-lockdown protesters would be uncovered. Yeah, people weren't happy about these. I guess the plan was to exchange the governor for freedom. I don't know. I didn't really look into it. The day after, on March 24th, 2020, both India and the UK went into lockdown. Including China, we now had over 2.6 billion people living under quarantine. Later that day, the International Olympic Committee and Japan postponed the 2020 Summer Olympics to 2021. On March 25th, the New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, Godofredo, ordered that all New York nursing homes must accept people who have a confirmed or suspected diagnosis. Now, this would become a huge controversy because the disease would spread like wildfire through the nursing homes, and a lot of people would die. Cuomo would receive a lot of the blame for killing seniors, and would eventually resign his governorship. But I mean, there were a couple of other reasons for that as well, but this was one of them. Honestly, this happened a lot around the United States and Canada. People knew that this affected the elderly a lot more, and the government was like, you know what, let's just fill up the nursing homes with infected people. It'll be great. Yeah, elected officials and medical experts didn't really have much of a clue about what they were doing when things first started. Then on March 26, 2020, it was confirmed that 23,000 people had died, and that there were now 500,000 confirmed cases. The numbers doubled in just 6 days, and would continue to increase at an exponential rate. Also at this point, the United States would become the leader in cases for the rest of the pandemic. On the same day, the states of Colorado and New Hampshire issued stay-at-home orders. On March 30th, 2020, the states of Maryland and Virginia issued stay-at-home orders as well. By now, a significant portion of the American population was under lockdown. Also around this time, gas prices were dropped to $23 a barrel, the lowest since 2002. Now this happened because of a couple of reasons. First, the oil demand went down dramatically with lockdowns because people weren't driving or flying anymore, but also because Russia and Saudi Arabia were fighting an oil price war. Both sides were increasing production to undercut the other. At one point, oil futures were in the negative price range, meaning that the cost of storing the oil was more expensive than the price they could fetch on the market. As a result, oil companies paid others to take their oil, as that was a cheaper option. Now I remember the gas prices were super low, and honestly it sucked because I didn't really need the oil. Like when I went to university, I was spending $500 a month on gas, and now I could have been paying a fraction of that price, but of course I didn't need it. It just sat there. Of course I couldn't stockpile the gas because it would go bad after like a year. You know that scene from The Last of Us where Bill gives Joel a hose to siphon gas from cars that just been sitting around for 20 years? Yeah, that wouldn't be possible in real life. Honestly, I just wish that Russia and Saudi Arabia had oil price wars more often. Anyhow, that was March, the month when things really got out of control, and social distancing and the new normal became the new lingua franca, and lockdowns became the new reality. This is what would define the insane year of 2020. We had capacity limits, we had the whole 6 feet distancing, all that sort of stuff. Remember the whole 6 feet distancing thing? I do wonder how that was supposed to be helpful. Like for some reason the disease just can't move 6 feet. Like what if it's a windy day or someone sneezes with godlike power? I mean, being 5 feet 11 inches surely wouldn't just magically put you in the danger zone. It doesn't really make any sense. And it turns out that didn't make much sense to Fauci either, because he admitted before Congress that the 6 feet distancing idea was pulled out of nowhere. I mean, he said that it was an empiric decision that wasn't really based on data. Now for me, these restrictions weren't super bad. I am kind of an introvert, and I also no longer needed to drive to university, and I saved a lot of money on gas and parking, and I pretty much had 2 free hours each day to relax or whatever. Eventually, I started going to the gym with my extra time. Speaking of gyms, they were kind of nice during 2020, because you had to make an appointment to go, and the capacity limits meant that there weren't usually many people there, and it was much easier to access machines and weights. Also, exams and everything else in school was now open book, which made university way easier, and there's nothing more relaxing than writing a final from your bedroom. I could get up, stretch whenever, and go to the bathroom without needing permission. It was a really interesting moment in time. In a way, I felt solidarity with the entire world. It felt as if everyone, regardless of who they were or where they were dealing with the same struggle at the same time. It was uniting, at least at the beginning. Now things would quickly become quite divisive. Mixed messaging from the authorities combined with excessive lockdowns and constant back and forth on policies demoralized the people and led to distrust and protests. But overall, March defined what 2020 would be, easily one of the most impactful months so far in the 21st century. Conclusion. And that, ladies and gentlemen, were the 4 months that changed 2020 and the world forever. By March, countries were suspending social events, international flights, and telling people to stay home. Humanity was now more socially isolated than it had ever been in a long time. The world was on edge, and no one knew what was happening. The optimistic believed that it would be over in months, but the more pessimistic believed that we were now living in a new normal, and that the world would never be the same again. Both would be proven wrong, as the pandemic lasted more than 2 years, but the world today has mostly returned to normal. Sometimes it is hard to see that anything ever happened, but there's still a part of us that was left behind. A part of us that we want back, but it won't come back. Now, there still will be a lot of craziness left to come in 2020. We would have the Black Lives Matter riots, the stock market going crazy in the summer, the infamous 2020 election, and the eventual completion of vaccines at the end of the year, and all the weirdness that came with that. Oh, and also we have the PS5 launch. And the PS5 launch, that was a rough one. Man, it was hard to find any of those. Man, it was harder to find a PS5 than it was toilet paper. 2020 at this point feels like ancient history, like a completely different era. My life has changed quite a bit. I finished school, I got a nice job, and like I said before, I've seen my family get smaller with the passing of my great grandma and grandma. People that I've known my entire life gone and never to be replaced. They didn't die because of the disease, but the simple flow of time. In a strange way, I am nostalgic about 2020. It was a time when I was younger, more carefree, and everyone around me was still alive. The momentum of the years that came before were still there. Things felt like they were getting better, and 2020 was the last year of that feeling. Since then, we've had large amounts of inflation, and the cost of living has gotten out of control. No one knows when or if things will completely go back to normal. I mean, they're mostly normal, but I do hope that housing prices come back to not insane levels. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I hope it'll be calmer than 2020. Like, I really hope that we don't end up in a nuclear war with Russia or China, because that would definitely be worse than 2020. Let me know if you guys want me to cover the rest of 2020, but for the time being, I'm going to stop here. These were the 4 months that changed the world, and my personal experiences as I lived through them. Let me know what your experiences were below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.